These are embossing stamp pads. We have the Versamark Watermark stamp pad, and this is the one that I tend to use the most often. It's a clear, sticky ink that embossing powder sticks to. I also have the Distress Embossing ink pad, and it works exactly the same way. Once you've stamped your image, you're going to want to put your embossing powder on top of that stamped image. I do it over scrap paper to collect any of the excess that can go right back into the jar. If you ever have a stamped image like the one on the right, that means your ink pad needs to be re-inked, and you can get refills for both of these. Both refills come in small squeeze bottles, and you just squeeze a little bit onto your pad, and I typically use the tip of the re-inker pad to swirl that ink in because it tends to be very thick and it doesn't just absorb in. It's always a great idea to have the re-inkers for your ink pads when they're available for times just like these. Now that we have them re-inked, let's try this again. So I'm going to ink my stamp and I'm going to stamp it onto the paper. I'm using two different stamps here. Whatever stamp you want will work. These are more solid. Lined stamps will also work with both of these inks. The ink from the Versamark pad is a little bit more of a sticky consistency, and the Distress is not. If you happen to get your embossing powder sticking to different areas of the paper, you'll want to use a dry brush to brush that off gently before embossing. Once your images are cleaned up, you can use an embossing tool to heat that powder and melt it in place. You do need to use an embossing tool. A blow dryer will not work. It doesn't emit heat, it blows air, and it will just dry up your ink. The embossing ink from both pads will stay wet for a couple minutes, so you can do this at your leisure. You don't have to rush through it. You can also use these embossing pads for watermark images. You just ink up your stamp and stamp it onto the paper, and it will create an image that's just slightly darker in shade to the paper that you're stamping on. Both of these ink pads work very well for what they're intended to. I tend to use the Versamark more than the Distress Embossing ink simply because it has a larger surface for the stamp pad, and you can kind of tell from my stamp pad that it is a lot more used. But both do well for both embossing as well as watermark images.